Policymakers and several heads of government will gather in Sandton from tomorrow to attend the second Africa Investment Forum. The forum is organized by the African Development Bank and its partners to raising capital and to accelerate financial closure of deals. And for more on this, I'm joined in studio by Vice President for Finance and the Chief Finance Officer for the African Development Bank Group, Swazi Tshabalala. Mr. Tshabalala, very good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Now, this is the second edition of the Africa Investment Forum, and it's held in South Africa. Why South Africa?
Well, I mean, I think, South Africa has a large pool of institutional investors, is used to hosting such, such forums. In a sense, last week, the South African government had its own investment forum. The World Economic Forum is held annually here in Cape Town, the regional one. So, I think the view was that, this is a community, or this is an area which is familiar to global investors.
Okay. Talk to me about the objectives of this forum and how the African Development Bank sets out to achieve them.
So our mandate is to facilitate the development of Africa through financing projects that are transformational. And to that end, we pursue many different avenues for identifying the best way of not only identifying projects, but also of ensuring that we can mobilize private sector financing towards those projects. Okay. So we do that, with partners. And last year, the president of the bank, Dr. Adeshina, decided that we needed something like this where there would be an opportunity to present deals that we had, had evaluated initially, and investors could come from all over the world in a formal setting and have the opportunity to actually engage the sponsors of those deals, and many times those sponsors are actually the countries. Mm-hmm. So last year, for instance, we had the president of Ghana who chaired the boardroom for one of the deals that was coming from Ghana. Okay. So it's really intended, it's an opportunity for us working with our partners. For instance, the Development Bank of Southern Africa is a partner in this Africa Investment Forum. Afri-Exim Bank is another. But it's an opportunity for us, to work in partnership with other like-minded organizations in Africa to try and get, mobilize global investment to come and finance projects in Africa.
I mean, in terms of taking stock and re-evaluating some of the deals that were struck and sealed in last year's edition of the Africa Investment Forum, how far have you gone? I mean, just, analyzing the progress that has been made insofar as implementing those deals.
So you'll recall last year that we came to the inaugural forum with deals worth $46.6 billion. At the end of them, there was investor interest expressed for deals to the value of $38.7 billion. Mm-hmm. So these deals vary, some of them are very big transformational, cross-border deals, which take time to actually bring to financial close. They're complex. Others were further away in terms of, their path to bankability. Others were less so. But we are pleased to be able to announce that we have about $12 billion of deals that were closed, now have reached financial close. Okay. So from having investor interest of $38.7 billion to actually closing $12 billion, and some of them will actually be announced at this year's forum.
And speaking of some of the projects or deals that have been closed, what are some of the sectors that you are targeting as a bank that you prioritize in terms of funding?
So we have, our 5 priority areas, which we call the high fives, the famous high fives. And these high fives are focused on agriculture, they're focused on energy, they're focused on integrating Africa, and really that's roads and rail. The other high five is related to social investments and agriculture, and then we have I've mentioned energy as well. Yeah. So basically, we try and limit the engagement on those major focus areas of the bank. And fortunately, there's great alignment between what we are doing and what our partners are doing. That's also their major focus. Yeah. Because the way we view Africa's development, it is dependent, first of all, on infrastructure being built, particularly road and rail, but more importantly, integrating the economies of Africa. As you know, the Continental Free Trade Agreement was ratified earlier this year, I think in May. And in fact, it's not possible, for these economies to thrive in that environment without those investments in infrastructure which link each other so that they can actually trade with each other.
And having said that, I mean, the Africa Investment Forum offers access to a structured platform offering bankable projects within an enabled environment. For example, I understand that South Korea is very much keen, in investing in some of these or accessing the pipeline of bankable African projects. But then, no prizes for guessing, Ms. Tshabalala, about what are some of the policy certainty issues on the continent, as well as some of the logistical bottlenecks, as it were. How do you navigate around those?
So part of I think the uniqueness of this particular platform is that the investors get to come here and look at deals that have actually been worked on, have been prepared for consideration by investors. But in addition to that, we bring policymakers to this forum for them to be able to answer investors' questions about exactly the issues that you raise. Policy uncertainty, what they are, particularly around monetary policy, fiscal policy, domestic resource mobilization. These are key policy issues that investors look at when they're looking at investing long term in any country. So I think the opportunity where you have ministers, you have presidents that come and actually are present in the boardroom where a transformational project in their country is being considered, and they're there not only taking responsibility for ensuring that project actually reaches closure, but also making sure that they are able to address investor concerns. Right.
Now, the Gauteng Premier's office noted that the biggest takeaways from last year's conference was the need for greater interconnection on the continent. But then taking into cognizance the fact that the expansion of some of the regional value chains on the continent was quite low.
Exactly. I mean, the value chains, a good example, in fact, is agriculture. One of the reasons we have focused on it, is that very often agriculture in Africa is not really as an important sector of various markets all over the continent, precisely because there isn't much investment in building value chains. There's a lot of things that are required, from planting, being able to grow successfully, getting information on the weather, being able to harvest, being able to put that harvest, on the road, in a safe road, and get it to customers, and being able to actually process that agricultural project instead of exporting the raw product, at least doing some value addition. So it's just one example of areas where we feel that there's a tremendous need and I think opportunity for investors to actually look at how we can increase the development of these value chains, linking domestic African production to international markets and obviously regional markets as well. Right.
I mean, you mentioned agriculture, which is very key. It serves as a major catalyst for Africa's development.
Absolutely.
And we wouldn't be doing any justice to this conversation without, of course, tackling the issue of China and the kind of influence that the global superpower wields on the continent. I mean, most of the African countries are now looking east, and China is the new big brother on the continent. Is that at all affecting the African Development Bank in a way?
Well, I mean, China, for instance, is a shareholder of the African Development Bank. All 54 countries of the continent are shareholders, but we have, of the remaining 81 shareholders, they're from all over the globe. So, we don't view China's involvement in Africa as per se, negative or nefarious. They have, in fact, I mean, I think, they might even be allowed to take some credit for generating, greater global investor interest in what's going on in Africa, you know, because they have made a lot of investments in the continent in important and necessary infrastructure. Now, of course, countries, you know, have to make sure that as they engage China, they are doing so responsibly, and they're doing so in a manner that doesn't result in them, you know, getting into debt distress. Because, you know, if you have countries getting into debt distress, it's you know, it's very negative for their own development. So we get involved, obviously, in our policy dialogues with a lot of the, you know, of our regional members, and we talk to them how they can improve, for instance, their debt management in their own countries.
So in terms of debt management, I mean, the reason that most of these African countries are now looking east and, you know, asking for China's assistance is the fact that they can't manage debt because the debt burden is quite massive. So where does that leave the African Development Bank then?
In terms of the debt?
In terms of accessing finance from China?
So obviously, I mean, we finance ourselves as a bank differently. So where we need to make a distinction between, you know, the capital that we raise from our shareholder. We do that periodically. In fact, we've just completed the recapitalization of the bank, where our shareholders, you know, agreed to give us an additional $112 billion of capital. Okay. So which is very different from what I think you're talking about, which is countries themselves going out and separately arranging debt deals with China and other countries in the world. So, you know, we have a team within the bank which engages with countries purely on a policy basis, you know, to say that, you know, for debt to be transformational, because debt is also not per se a bad thing. Yes. It depends what you do with that debt, yes, you know,
and how you manage it.
Exactly, yeah. Exactly. So this is where we come in as a bank. We come in to engage with those countries and to help them, you know, enhance, you know, those capabilities and build their capacity around debt management and deploying debt responsibly and additively when it comes to their economies.
Ms. Tshabalala, in terms of mobilizing climate finance through the Africa Financial Alliance for Climate Change, how does the bank aim to, you know, shift the portfolios of African financial institutions towards climate-friendly projects across the continent?
I mean, I think, you know, you can see the devastation that climate change is causing. So we're not denialists when it comes to that, because we see it. We see it in the countries that we operate in. So we've made a commitment that we will focus a greater proportion of our financing towards, especially on energy, towards green energy. We've already spent $25 billion, and we intend to double that in the next 5 years. So where our focus is on making sure that we can help African economies transition to green energy, and funds like those are actually very useful because, you know, if you take a country that has, you know, is rich in fossil fuels, and, you know, it makes sense and it's cheap for them to use those fossil fuels to power their economy, but it's not necessarily a good thing, you know, for the environment. And anyway, we see climate finance as a great opportunity, in fact, for economies on the continent. So you know, so we see our role as not only, you know, facilitating access to energy, but we also see it as facilitating access to clean energy as much as possible. Yeah. A good example is the project that we are currently developing, which is called Desert to Power, which is a major project in the Sahel region. So this is the countries that border the Sahara, yeah, in North Africa. Yeah. So I mean, that project will eventually give access to 250 million people in that region to power. It's a massive, massive project, and 11 gigawatts. So and all of it will be green energy.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting that you are saying that the bank will be focusing on green energy and clean energy, but then taking into cognizance that a multi-billion-dollar petrochemical project in Egypt and the Kigali Innovation City project in Rwanda Only two of the projects which featured quite prominently during the maiden Africa Investment Forum in November last year, and looking at the fact that there is a potential boom of gas in northern Mozambique. So is this an area that you'll be focusing on or lavishing attention and resources on?
Absolutely. I mean, I use the word transition very deliberately, because, you cannot ask a country which is rich, for instance, in energy, in gas, as an example, to say, oh, ignore that deposit, do nothing with it, and go green entirely. So there will be a period. And I mean, this is a problem that countries around the world face, You don't automatically go from burning coal for your energy to being 100% clean and shutting off all your power stations. It's impossible.
When you talk of transition, does that mean that you'll be turning your back on one sector and then focusing more on the other sector?
Yes, that's what we'll be encouraging. For instance, I can say this because the president of the bank has said it. We will no longer be financing coal-powered projects, as an example. But that doesn't mean that we won't be financing gas-powered projects, because we see obviously that there is a continuum of energy sources and their cleanliness, if I can use those words. So, but again, over time, if you have an opportunity, in the Sahel, it simply doesn't make sense, to not use all of that sunshine in that region to actually power that region, and consider using coal or even gas and other sources, when in fact it probably makes the best sense to use all of that sunshine in the region to power it. So we will help countries transition. I think that's the important thing, but we are quite clear that our focus is on helping Africa not only turn towards powering itself with clean energy, but also benefiting from the green climate economy, because it has many opportunities, industries that can be built around those, that new opportunity, and it's a global effort, it's a global project, and we see win-win in countries transitioning towards that.
All right, Ms. Tshabalala, all the best in tomorrow's Africa Forum investment. Much appreciated. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.
That was the Vice President for Finance and Chief Finance Officer for the African Development Bank Group, Swazi Tshabalala. This is the Global SABC News. We'll take a quick break. We'll be right back.